The universe had rules, or so the Galactic Council kept insisting. Rules about advancement, rules about capability, rules about which species deserved to sit at the big table and which ones deserved to serve drinks while the important conversations happened. The Valorians had written most of these rules, naturally, because having 3 brains and 4 arms gave them what they called innate superiority and what everyone else called an insufferable attitude problem. The Crystalline Collective had co-authored the rulebook with mathematical precision, arguing that consciousness itself could be quantified and ranked. The Ethereals had nodded along while secretly thinking they were too sophisticated to engage with such primitive hierarchies, which was just another form of thinking you were superior, but with more pretension. And humanity? Well, humanity had shown up to the party relatively recently, still figuring out the difference between faster-than-light travel and accidentally arriving in the wrong solar system. Humanity had been handed a participation trophy and told to sit quietly in the corner while the adults handled galactic affairs. But then everything stopped being about rules, because the Obsidian tablet showed up and burned everyone who tried to enforce them. The tablet had emerged from Velcaros, a world so thoroughly dead that even its grave had been dead for millennia. Archaeological teams had been systematically cataloging the ruins, when some historians were still arguing about who, exactly, had uncovered it buried beneath layers of crystallized atmospheric residue and the general depression of abandonment. The tablet was black. Not metaphorically black, not symbolically black, but the kind of black that made other blacks look like they were just doing their best. It absorbed light. It absorbed radiation. It probably would have absorbed meaning, if meaning had been tangible enough to grab onto. And when people touched it, they burned. Not immediately. Not with any consistent pattern. But they burned, and they screamed, and they came back changed, if they came back at all. The first victim had been a junior archaeologist from the Architects, a species that prided itself on rational analysis and systematic problem-solving. She'd touched the tablet for less than a second. When they pulled her away, her consciousness was fragmented across 17 different temporal states, perceiving past, present, and future simultaneously. She'd spent the first 3 hours weeping, then had achieved a state of eerie calm while speaking fluent languages in dead civilizations. The medics had sedated her, but her eyes kept tracking things that weren't there, following events that hadn't happened yet. Then came the Valorian delegation. Their lead scientist, a creature of arrogance and overconfidence named Threxval, had announced with absolute certainty that the tablet was obviously some kind of test. A test of what? He remained conveniently vague about, but he was absolutely certain that his superior intellect would crack it within hours. He'd approached with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem they couldn't solve by thinking about it really hard. He'd touched the tablet while delivering a lecture about the inadequacy of other species' problem-solving methodologies. What came out of his mouth after that was a stream of consciousness that made even the most experienced psychologists uncomfortable. He remembered being 7 different people. He remembered living 8,000 years. He remembered events from his childhood that hadn't happened yet. He remembered forgetting. He remembered things that had no name, concepts that had no language, experiences that existed in the spaces between thoughts. The Valorians had taken him back to their ship and now kept him sedated because his screaming was making the younger officers nervous. The Crystalline Collective sent their most advanced computational analyst next. Shimmer of the algorithmic deep was a being of living mathematics, consciousness expressed as pure formula. They'd approached the problem with their characteristic precision, calculating 17 different ways to safely interact with the tablet. They'd built protective fields, quantum barriers, mathematical abstractions designed to filter the tablet's effects through layers of computational insulation. None of it mattered. The tablet had burned Shimmer right through the protective schema, and now the analyst existed in a state of fluctuating coherence. Sometimes they could manifest physically. Sometimes they scattered across probability matrices. When they tried to speak, mathematics itself seemed to rebel, equations folding in on themselves, formulas that described nothing. The crystallines had attempted to contain them in a computational loop, but Shimmer kept phasing through the boundaries, still screaming about numbers that wanted to be heard, about mathematical truths that shouldn't exist. The ethereals, beings of profound wisdom and even more profound self-satisfaction, had sent an ambassador called Resonance of the Infinite Possible. They'd approached with the serene confidence of a species that had transcended petty concerns like physical form and rational thought. Resonance had claimed that the tablet would communicate on a higher plane of consciousness, that three-dimensional limitations wouldn't apply to their transcendent awareness. They touched it with what could only be described as spiritual certainty. What remained of resonance was scattered across multiple dimensional states, sometimes visible, sometimes screaming in frequencies that instruments could barely register. The ethereals had initially insisted this was intentional, a form of enlightenment. After 12 hours, when resonance started trying to communicate through reflected starlight in increasingly panicked ways, they'd stopped calling it enlightenment and started calling it regrettable. By the time the Obsidian tablet research facility had been established in neutral space, orbiting a nameless star, the pattern was clear. Every species that touched it burned. Every single one. The burns were different depending on the psychology of the toucher, the neurochemistry of the species, the fundamental assumptions they made about consciousness and reality. But the result was always the same. Damaged minds, fractured understanding, perspectives that had been violently expanded beyond what they could comfortably contain. Vessel of Protocol, the facility commander, was an architect of the practical variety, which meant she was systematically losing her mind. She'd started the week with a comprehensive research plan. By day 3, she was rearranging her data files by emotional resonance instead of chronological order. By day 6, she was speaking to the tablet directly, asking it questions that had no answers, like, why can't you just tell us what you want? And, is everyone going to go insane? Or will the process eventually reach a natural conclusion? By day 9, she'd started scheduling her breakdown time, which was either a sign of professional discipline or complete psychological dissolution. Honestly, hard to tell the difference anymore. The observation gallery had become a zoo of desperate academia. Representatives from 47 different species crowded behind protective barriers, watching their brightest minds make voluntary offerings of their sanity to the black surface of an incomprehensible object. The conversations had devolved into increasingly desperate theorizing. Someone from the harmonists kept insisting the tablet was a musical instrument, which didn't make any sense but had the advantage of being poetically incoherent. The synthetics suggested it might be a computer, but their computational models kept crashing in ways that suggested the tablet was using math that they literally couldn't perceive. The biological collective theorized that it might be some form of organism, which nobody wanted to think about too carefully. Mostly, the gallery was filled with the sound of theories collapsing under their own weight, punctuated by occasional screaming from the medical wing, where earlier test subjects were having their consciousness gradually reassembled. That's when the human walked in. Her name was Meredith Corvin, which probably meant nothing to anyone in the galaxy except the handful of people who'd bothered to read Earth's contact records. She was a historian, not a physicist, not a neuroscientist, not anyone with credentials that would make her relevant to cutting-edge research. She was exactly the kind of expert that a galactic scientific community would categorize as nice to have at parties but useless for actual problems. She'd been assigned to the human delegation, not because she was brilliant, but because most of Earth's actual scientists had more important things to do, and Meredith had made the terrible mistake of being available and moderately interested in space travel. She'd spent the first 2 weeks of her assignment sitting in the observation gallery, drinking recycled water that tasted like despair, and watching the galaxy's most advanced minds disassemble themselves against the black surface of an object that seemed to be actively hostile to consciousness. She'd watched species after species bring their best minds, their sharpest intellects, their most advanced protective protocols. She'd watched them all fail. She'd watched them all burn. And something about it was starting to make sense to her. Not rational sense. Not the kind of sense you could write in a grant proposal or defend in peer review. But the kind of sense that came from understanding patterns in history, from reading the stories people told about themselves across centuries and civilizations, from recognizing the shape of myths even when they were wearing unfamiliar forms. By the third week, Meredith was spending most of her time in the facility's archive, pulling records of human history, comparing it to the patterns she was observing. Humans had a long history of encountering things they didn't understand and trying to solve them through their existing frameworks. Humans had a long history of burning themselves on things they approached with confidence instead of humility. Humans had a long history of creating monuments to things they'd lost, time capsules of meaning, messages left for descendants who didn't speak the same language anymore. And then, in the archive, she found something. A record from Earth's mythology archives about something called the Akashic Records, the idea that all knowledge was stored somewhere, accessible if you knew how to remember it. The concept had been pure mythology, pure human dreamweaving. But what if, Meredith wondered, what if someone had taken that idea seriously enough to build it? What if the Obsidian tablet was someone's Akashic record? What if it was consciousness itself, preserved and left behind, burning everyone who tried to access it with tools they weren't designed to have? She walked into Vessel of Protocol's office without knocking and announced that she wanted to touch the tablet. The response was remarkably consistent: panic. Everyone panicked. The Valorians panicked because they didn't want to see a human succeed where their superior intellects had failed. The crystallines panicked because the mathematical probability of her surviving was so low that running the calculation broke their predictive models. The ethereals panicked because the concept of a human being the solution to their problem violated their entire understanding of universal order. Even Vessel of Protocol panicked, though her panic was more professionally articulated, as explained the scientific reasoning behind this obviously suicidal decision. Meredith couldn't really explain it. She just had a feeling. History was full of feelings. Like this. Hunches. Intuitions. The vague sense that you understood something on a fundamental level that existed below language. She'd studied human history long enough to know that those hunches were often where the most important breakthroughs came from. "Let me try," she said simply. "I'm running out of things to lose." They let her try, mostly because Vessel of Protocol had run out of ideas, and Meredith technically wasn't important enough that her death would constitute a major diplomatic incident. If she burned, well, that was just how research went sometimes. Humanity was used to being expendable anyway. The tablet chamber was smaller in person than it appeared in the holodisplays. The tablet floated in its containment field, an object of perfect, absolute black, surrounded by every safety protocol the galaxy could devise. Meredith stood outside the protective barrier and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You're sure about this?" one of the technicians asked through the comm. "No," Meredith said, "but I've read enough history to know that certainty is usually what gets you killed. At least if I'm confused, I've got the right attitude." She stepped through the barrier. The chamber's temperature dropped immediately. In the observation gallery, beings pressed themselves against the protective barriers. Krelmoth, the Valorian who was currently experiencing consciousness across multiple temporal states, suddenly focused completely on Meredith, his multiple layers of awareness converging on the single point of the human about to die in real time. Meredith walked to the center of the chamber. She didn't hurry. She didn't hesitate. She just walked like she was approaching something she understood, something she'd been expecting to find her whole life without knowing what it was. She stopped about half a meter away from the tablet and looked at its surface, that absolute black that seemed to contain its own gravity, its own pull. "I think I know what you are," she said quietly. "I think I know exactly what this is, and I think I know why everyone's burning." Through the comm system, Vessel of Protocol opened her mouth to protest. But Meredith was already raising her hand. "Everyone who's touched you has been trying to understand you," Meredith continued, her voice steady. "They've been trying to solve you. They've been treating you like a problem to be cracked with their frameworks, their intelligence, their knowledge. But you don't work like that, do you? You work the opposite way. You don't make sense in their terms. You can't be understood through their methodologies. You burn them because they're approaching you wrong. Because they think comprehension means fitting you into their existing systems. But that's not what you are." She took another step closer. The tablet's surface rippled subtly, like water sensing nearby motion. "You're not a puzzle," Meredith said. You're a memory. You're not asking to be solved, you're asking to be remembered. Her hand touched the black surface. The universe, it turned out, was good at making noise, but it hadn't really committed to actual screaming until that moment. Alarms erupted everywhere. Emergency protocols activated simultaneously. In the gallery, beings started backing away, certain they were about to witness a human being catastrophically destroyed. In the medical wing, the previous test subjects suddenly went rigid. Shimmer of the algorithmic deep briefly achieved perfect clarity before shattering across 17 probability states. The Valorian scientist started weeping. The ethereal ambassador began phase cycling between dimensions faster than the scanners could track. But Meredith wasn't screaming. She was remembering. She was remembering things she'd never lived through. She was remembering being part of a civilization that had risen and fallen before any of the current galactic powers had even figured out fire. She was remembering technology so advanced it looked like magic. She was remembering beauty and horror and mathematics that described things that shouldn't exist. She was remembering loss. She was remembering the moment when they'd realized they were dying, that their world was ending, that something needed to be preserved. She was remembering the decision to create this, to encode everything into black stone, to leave it where the future would find it and test themselves against it. She was remembering being human, in ways that were both specific and infinitely deep, remembering humanity not as it was now but as it could be, should be, might be across infinite iterations of possibility. And she said, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away and also from every point simultaneously, I remember. When her hand finally lifted from the tablet, the chamber had gone absolutely still. The black surface had changed. It wasn't less black, but it was different somehow. It was contained black instead of infinite black. It was a surface again instead of an absence. Meredith turned around, and her eyes held something that hadn't been there before. Not insanity, not damage, but depth, perspective. The look of someone who'd lived 1,000 lifetimes in a single moment. It's human, she said simply. The tablet is human. Or it was. Or it will be. It's kind of complicated. Vessel of Protocol stepped forward, her carefully maintained composure cracking like an egg. What do you mean, it's human? Humans are a young species. We barely understand chemistry. That's what it means, Meredith said, and she was smiling now, that particular smile that comes from understanding something everyone else has been missing. That's exactly what it means. You've all been assuming advancement is linear. You've all been assuming that civilization moves forward in a single direction, that younger means less capable, that you know what intelligence looks like. But what if humanity did something different? What if we didn't advance the way you expect? What if we did something that you can only understand by burning? She walked back toward the observation area, leaving the tablet floating in its field, now looking almost peaceful in its absolute blackness. 50,000 years from now, Meredith continued as she walked, humanity might do something. We might create something. We might want to leave ourselves a message, a reminder, a piece of us that could survive anything. And we might decide that the only way to encode it safely would be to make it impossible to access except through a specific kind of consciousness, a specific kind of understanding, the kind that comes not from calculation but from recognition, the kind that comes from remembering. You're saying, one of the crystallines said slowly, that you are remembering something that hasn't happened yet? I'm saying, Meredith replied, that from the tablet's perspective, tense is probably something you stop worrying about. It's showing me what it means to be human across all possible timelines, all possible iterations. It's showing me what humans could create if we needed to. It's showing me what we might leave behind if we ever needed to save ourselves. The gallery erupted. Species began arguing. The Valorian started insisting this was clearly a hoax. The crystallines began frantically trying to calculate time paradoxes. The ethereals simply vanished, probably into a dimension where they could think about this, without the immediate threat of having to acknowledge that a young species had just outthought them. Krelmoth, perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously, started laughing like someone who'd just understood a cosmic joke that had been set up billions of years ago. Here's the thing that's going to keep you all up at night, Meredith said, and her voice had taken on that particular tone of someone delivering a punchline to a joke that had been waiting to be told since before any of these species had written their rulebooks. The tablet burned everyone because everyone was trying to access it as an external object. They were trying to solve it as a puzzle outside themselves. But I could touch it because I understood what it was asking. It wasn't asking to be understood. It was asking to be recognized as a story. And stories don't burn you unless you're trying to make them into something they're not. She paused at the observation barrier. For thousands of years, she continued, you've been treating us like we don't matter, like we're jokes, like we're that weird species that still uses things like emotion and intuition instead of pure logic. And then we show up with proof that some part of humanity, somewhere in time, figured out how to create something that your best minds can't even comprehend without breaking. That's not because we're more advanced than you, that's because we're advanced in ways you haven't learned to recognize yet. Vessel of Protocol stepped closer. What happens now, with the tablet? Meredith looked back at it, at the perfect black surface floating in its field, at the monument to something that hadn't happened yet, but was somehow already here. Now, she said, you all have to figure out what it means that humans might be something other than you assumed. You have to figure out what it means that advancement doesn't look like you think it looks. You have to figure out what it means that the universe might value things like memory and recognition and the ability to understand a story as much as it values calculation and logic and speed. She smiled again, that knowing smile. You'll probably take about 1,000 years to really get it, but at least now you know you should be looking. At least now you know that the young species you dismissed as trivial might have something to teach you about being alive, about being conscious, about being the kind of intelligence that leaves messages in black stone for the future to find and burn themselves against and finally understand. The Obsidian tablet floated in its chamber, black and serene and absolutely certain, waiting for the next being brave or foolish enough to touch it. Meredith walked out of the facility. And behind her, the galaxy's most advanced minds began the long process of reconsidering everything they'd ever assumed about intelligence, advancement, and what it meant to matter in a universe too large for certainty. And somewhere in time, in a future that was also a past that was also somehow right now, something that was human smiled and wrote another line into the tablet. We remembered. That was enough.